there is a reply to this kind of skepticism, and the reply is, hang on a second, look within yourself, because what is it? What are you invested in here in terms of an identity? Where are you taking your stand? And why does it feel so good to say astrology is silly?
Yeah.
Why does that feel so good for you? Why do you feel so self-righteous, a little bit smart? And I know this experience because I was quite an arrogant young man. I know what it's like to taste that certitude, that righteousness. It feels good. I mean, it's perverse, but it feels good.
Hi, I'm Kat, the Seeker half of The Seeker and The Skeptic, and I'm very excited to share with you today the conversation between my co-host Rebecca and Andrew Taggart. Andrew calls himself a practical philosopher, and he basically provides philosophical counselling to people all over the world. It seems like a lot of people from Silicon Valley as well. And he basically helps people think through what a good life means and hopefully helps them realise it. We mentioned his talk on total work in our Tradwife episode, if you caught that or want to scroll back through the archives to check it out. For our next interview, I'll be back interviewing a skeptic. So if you haven't checked out our previous guest interviews, I strongly recommend you do that. We've had some great people on the show. And you can find the links to those on our YouTube page or your favourite podcast app. On the regular episodes of The Seeker and the Skeptic, myself and Rebecca explore all sorts of fringe topics from angels to aliens. And you can find out more about that at seekerandskeptic.com. We're also on social media too, so just search for @SeekerSkeptic on Instagram and Twitter. We hope this conversation will inspire you to talk to somebody on the other side of the Seeker and Skeptic divide.
Hi, Andrew. Welcome to The Seeker and the Skeptic. It's so lovely to have you.
Oh, it's so lovely to be here.
So I'm the skeptic, which I guess in this scenario must make you the seeker, right?
let's say it does.
So does that word resonate with you? Does that mean that do you feel like a seeker?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't used to be like a seeker. I didn't used to be quite so crunchy and granola-like. I grew up pretty straight-laced.
Oh, really? So is that what being a seeker means to you? There's like the hippie connotation.
It means someone who's willing to walk the beaten track, the beaten path, the road less traveled, really.
Yeah.
At some point, you begin to realize that our ordinary ways of living somehow are unsatisfactory, but there may be a separate path, or even as some traditions call it, a pathless path you step on, and before you know it, you have longer hair and a beard.
Yeah, I don't really understand it's interesting because I'm much more drawn to the seeker aesthetic than I am to the skeptical aesthetic. But it's weird the way that like this whole look that goes along with an ideology or a philosophy. I'm not entirely sure why that happens.
I don't know if this is going to be the juicy part of our conversation, but I think it's the case that it's a suggestion that you're freer. Right? You don't have to conform to the dictates of a business suit.
Yeah.
T.S. Eliot, an English person, a wonderful poet. I mean, used to write about the flannel business suit that he would see people wearing as they would go into finance. So I think the suggestion is that you're trying to envision what it's like to be free in myriad senses.
I guess also it's a signal to other people to be like, hey, I'm cool. We can talk about things. Like,
we can talk about weird things.
Yeah, exactly. Come over to me and talk about UFOs. I'm up for it, sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah.
So is that what you would say if you are a seeker, then is that you're seeking the pathless path, the other path?
Yes. Well, okay. So I'm seeking a few different things. One would be that I did finish a PhD in a very straight-laced institution. Then I left the institution behind because I wanted to seek wisdom. I didn't necessarily want to cultivate theoretical knowledge of the kind you find in a university. And wisdom and theoretical knowledge are quite different in nature. So philosophy or philosophia is the path of living wisdom. So that's one thing I've been seeking over the years. Another thing I've been seeking and is in the last 4 or 5 years has been enlightenment, which is it's a big thing.
Wow,
And,
yeah.
so we could talk about that as well if that were interesting. And so that brought me into Zen Buddhism, and also more recently into an Indian tradition called Advaita Vedanta.
Oh, I've
Those
heard
are
of that, but I don't know much about it.
both would be called direct paths to realizing the true nature of yourself. And I can unpack that later. So that's the second one. So wisdom and then enlightenment. The third one, which will get us back to this counterculturalism, is love. I think that love is extraordinarily important. And I don't necessarily just mean romantic love, though I am married. I mean the actual ability to love and to act out of love for all beings. I like the word love better than compassion, which is more of a Buddhist term, because I think it has something, it's more of an emotional charge for me.
Yeah.
So those three, wisdom and enlightenment and love.
Okay. I guess these are like 3 different potential routes to find or to explore something that maybe people might call meaning. Does that sound right to you? I feel like all of these 3 things are kind of going for something similar, in that they're trying to create a like a sort of a narrative to life. Like, it's interesting that, I mean, obviously we're humans, we all think in narratives, but that idea of paths towards things, we're on a journey, we're going down a path, we're passing different, signposts or landmarks on our way. And I wonder what you think that urge is to even get you started, to get you out of your suit and your philosophy degree. Why are you looking for these paths in the first place? What is it about humans that make us seek this stuff out?
Right. Beautiful question. And I'd love to turn to a discussion about the nature of meaning and the importance of meaning. I think there really are 2 things that get the search going, or get the inquiry going, or get people to start looking around. The first is that people realize that they're suffering.
Mm.
And they realize that suffering in a very deep way. So I would say that if you become a seeker, as it were, you start to climb the ladder. So you might first realize that you're suffering, or that something is amiss. I'm using the Buddhist term here, dukkha. It means something is unsatisfactory, something is off, something isn't quite right, and I don't know why. So usually you would begin by talking to your parents. Let's say if you're younger, well, why do I hurt? And they provide you with an explanation, and you realize the explanation is woefully unsatisfactory. And some part of you realizes that at some point you think, oh, I see. They don't seem to have the answers to the questions I'm seeking, I'm looking for. So then maybe you go later on to a counselor or a psychologist, and a counselor or psychologist is very good at trying to help you with a particular kind of suffering. Maybe the suffering brought about by the way you were raised, or certain forms of trauma. It's a very valuable role, but maybe your suffering isn't quite at that level, right? Maybe you're absolutely fine, you're able to function, you feel healed, or as healed as you may be. So you begin to realize that learning to function in the world is not quite the same thing as trying to resolve your suffering at a higher level. So that's usually when people start to really branch out. They might go into areas of spirituality, they might go into philosophy. You see them starting to read a lot more. Maybe they go to India, or they used to do that in the 60s and 70s. The suffering starts to become a mechanism whereby the search is initiated and continues. So that's the first way, I would say. It's very common. You can see it in the life of the Buddha, or the one we call the Buddha. You can see it in other people's lives as well, those living today. The other one is, let's call it the psychedelic path, just for fun. The other path that brings people to seek has to do with having some kind of perspective shifting experience that might have occurred through psychedelics, but certainly might have occurred through other means. And that person begins to realize that his or her ordinary take on reality is not the final take. And this altered state, you might say, whether it came about through chance or whether it came about through psychedelics or whether it came about through a conversation, begins to seem, so to speak, more real than the ordinary way of just navigating through the world or coping with the world as it is. So that's, maybe you might call it a mystical path, because it suggests that there is a more comprehensive or realer way to live than ordinary way. And it's not necessarily out there in the cosmos or in an afterlife. It's here and now. It's just removing the veil of illusion, as it were. So
That's what
things.
actually, that thing of something being realer than real life, that's what really scared me. As for the podcast, we went and did ayahuasca. It was almost exactly a year ago, and that's that thing that people were describing about having an experience while under the influence of a drug, and it seeming more real than real life. That was so intimidating to me going in, because I was thinking this is like some kind of thing that tricks your brain and takes you out of reality, and like, how can you trust that feeling that it is realer? Like, I'm no doubt people have that experience, but that's just an experience. We all have strange experiences when we're doing drugs. So, well, most of us do. So that thing of like knowing how to judge your experience and how much weight to give it. And I think part of my fear was that somehow my brain was going to be broken and reoriented in a way that, you know, made me eat more granola and, you know, I don't know, stop wearing shoes.
I wear shoes, for the record. Yeah, I would advise wearing them.
But that's, I think that's like, that's often people's hesitation, or that it's not necessarily that you don't trust that something's going to happen. You're scared that what might happen might change you so profoundly that you can't find your way back. And that might be like, well, of course, why should you find your way back to your life before, you know, this amazing experience? But, you know, that's where your family and friends live. So you don't want to lose touch with it entirely.
It's a beautiful reply. It's a beautiful skeptical reply, you might say. Let's take a different experience just to make it simpler. I'll describe my own. So I've followed both paths. I've felt that there's something unsatisfactory about life as it is, and I've also noticed that there's something awe-inspiring or wonderful about certain experiences I've had. And awe-inspiring and wonderful is a little bit of a flat way of putting it. It was more, there were much more than that. So here's one. It was, I believe, November 2012, and the woman who became my wife and I meditated for the first time. I hadn't meditated before that in a seated posture with eyes closed, things of that nature. So we're sitting down a yoga mat in the Upper East Side of New York City, and we're holding hands. I kid you not. I haven't seen since that that's part of a meditation practice, nor is it part of my own. But so we're holding hands. We have our eyes closed. It couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. I don't really know what I'm doing, to be sure. And we open our eyes. Nothing happened, understandably enough. And then we go out of my apartment at that time, which is a few blocks from Central Park. We walk to Central Park, and it's only when we cross the threshold into Central Park that things start to become absolutely amazing. And we both feel this, and she turns to me and says, "What's going on?" I said, I'm a philosopher at this point. I'm philosophizing with people. I say, "Don't talk about it. Just don't ask questions. Just very Taoistically write it out. What is this like?" And succinctly put, it was non-judgmental. Everything was non-judgmental. There was not the comparison of this over against that. There was less of a sense of self, which is what a number of Eastern traditions will describe. It was a heightened sense of reality. Everything was, as I would put it, everything was as it should be. Everything was beautiful. And to say everything is beautiful in ordinary language is not even to remotely do it justice. It was unspeakably beautiful. Time fell away. Space didn't have the same qualities it ordinarily has. And there's just It's just absolutely, exquisitely, stunningly lovely. Without being a different world. So that's the key part here, right? This was not some kind of different world. It was still Central Park. There were still pigeons, which were absolutely beautiful, frankly. I remember saying this plastic bag. So from this perspective, the plastic bag was just a thing of art. It was exquisite. I remember looking at the traffic flowing by, which was glorious. And we went into a tea shop. I actually wanted to get some tea for an English person who I visited recently. And so we went into the tea shop and we began smelling. There were the ones that were these little, you could open them up and smell. So we're in there, we're just smelling them. They all smell so wonderful. And I can imagine that the tea shop owners must have been thinking, okay, what's going on with these two? So it was about I didn't know how long it lasted. We could talk about how the sense of time usually drops off during these non-ordinary experiences. But the point is that afterward, it was probably 2.5 hours or so of a completely different understanding and way of being in the world. Now, I present you with that particular case to reply to the skeptic here. Because it seems to me that that's a better description of what life could be like for us. Could it be the case that we're more non-judgmental? I think so. I mean, I've certainly found that to be true in my own life since I've been on this meditative path. Could be the case that we're more loving, more understanding, and it's more intuitive as well. It's not though I have to cogitate about the matter in order to think, should I love this person? Should I be more understanding? No, as a matter of fact, I find myself just being understanding, being loving. Is it possible to actually apprehend the beauty of the world, notwithstanding all the social problems and political problems that indeed have arisen and continue to arise? It is. They're not contradictory viewpoints to say that it's possible to see the world somehow as being exquisitely beautiful, and in the next breath realizing that there is climate change and a planetary meta crisis. So I'm also trying to respond to the one who thinks this is really Pollyannish, right? It's Pollyannish to think that things are very beautiful and lovely, and that you can be in the world in a different way. So the first response is to say, look, let's not go with some of the more difficult cases have to do with journeying, right? These kind of psychedelic journeys that take you into these kind of phantasmagoric spaces. Set those aside. Start with the one that's just a heightened experience of the world we find ourselves in. And the second thing is, please go.
I think that, I mean, the fact that it's so difficult to describe those experiences because I've certainly, I mean, we were just bonding before we started recording over our love of nature. And I've certainly had those experiences, not so much with traffic lights and cars going past, but when I'm lucky enough to be in a place where there aren't those things. And this is obviously a spiritual failing on my part, but I can't see the beauty in the traffic. But when I am in, and I'm confronted with a massive tree and I can just see it for what it is, I've had those moments where I feel like my whole self expanding, and it's amazing. It's a beautiful experience. And I think one of the reasons people reach for spiritual explanations for those sort of things is because language is so inadequate. And as a skeptic, obviously, I think that's kind of a mistake. I don't think we need the spiritual explanations. I think it can be okay to just say, this is how it is, and I'm perceiving it as beautiful. I don't think we need to reach for gods or monsters or fairies or any of the many, not that those aren't great metaphors for some people. I just don't think they're necessary.
I agree with you. I don't think we need, if by spiritual explanations you mean supernatural explanations, then I would agree with you. Yeah, I mean, there's another way of talking about spirit or spirituality or some such. We're at this particular moment in time, we also lack the language to describe all the experiments that are going on right now that seem to fall under the header of spirituality, but don't seem to fall under the header of organized religion. But not all those experiments are supernatural.
Yeah, I think I'm wary of using the word spiritual, and it might just be like a convention that among my people, the skeptics, we don't use words like that. Although there have been a couple of really, Spirituality for the Skeptic. I can't remember who wrote that, but that was describing the same things you're describing. And Sam Harris's approach, spiritual ideas. See, I can't help but do the inverted. It's like I'll sit on my hands, but I can't help it.
Well, I think that we can sit at our hands when it comes to the language. We can't. I guess for me, we can't sit our hands when it comes to the actual experiences.
Yeah. So
that's where there can't be quotes. They are so.
Yeah.
They're indubitable, so far as I can say. So far as I can tell.
So does this kind of feels a bit like a theory of where spirituality or even religion comes from in the first place? If we human beings are the sort of beings that generate these experiences, and then we need to tell each other about them and communicate them, and so we put them into language, and language is a whole bunch of metaphors, and at some point it becomes something more than what it originally was, or something less than it originally was, if you want to think about it that way. But it becomes like more of a supernatural thing than a this world thing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I've heard that theory before. I'm willing to go along with it. This is so. Karl Jaspers was a German philosopher in the 20th century who suggested that around the 8th century BCE to the 3rd century BCE, we witness a flowering of whatever it is that we're talking about right now. And that this period gave rise to pre-Socratic and Socratic philosophy and the schools of philosophy in Greece that followed therefrom. It gave rise to the Vedas and to the Upanishads. It gave rise to Confucian thought, as well as the Tao Te Ching and Lao Tzu, Guanzo. It also gave rise to the prophets in Israel.
And that's what they refer to as the axial age. Is that?
That's the axial age.
Yeah.
So the Silicon Valley types would like this because it's a pivot.
They love pivoting.
Yeah, I love pivoting. And so this is an extraordinarily important time. Now I'm getting old. I think I forgot my thread. So what was it?
Let me pivot then,
good.
if we may.
We may.
Just because you brought up the Silicon Valley thing, it got me thinking about this phrase I've heard thrown around a lot lately, about the meaning crisis. Like this idea that, and it has a sort of sense of urgency around it. People are like, we're in a meaning crisis. This is a meaning crisis. It's like, it's going on now. Everyone's coming down with it. It's a thing. And every time I hear people talking about it, it seems to me that perhaps more people are recognizing it, or we have a new kind of, trendy term to describe it. But this seems like a perennial problem that humanity has always dealt with.
I'm not entirely sure. Frankly, I haven't listened to all of John Vervaeke's 50 hours of
no, me neither.
recorded talks. But viewers and listeners might not know that you're referring to John Vervaeke's thesis and his podcast, or I guess the talk series called The Meaning Crisis.
But it's not just him. I feel like a lot of people are talking and using that terminology. Maybe it originated with him, but it's really taken off.
Okay, well, and so I'll try to provide one reason why we might be questioning whether there's meaning at this point. So, succinctly put, let's suppose we make the turn to modernity as we have, and let's say, and your skeptical mind might not go along with this, but let's say that most civilizations have had three basic components. Three basic elements.
Okay.
One is some understanding of the human, so something that's called anthropos, or the nature of a human being. What is that nature? What is the essence of being human? The second was a cosmos, and it would take a while to explain what a cosmos is, but generally it's understood as an orderly, systematic, organically understood, often beautiful whole, in which the human finds himself or herself, and to which the human belongs. So in the journey, we don't have a cosmos, we have a universe, and they're completely different understandings. And the third is that most cultures or civilizations have had some idea of divinity, or it could be indigenous peoples who have a more pantheistic or animistic understanding of deity or divinity or sacred. I'm trying to finesse this conversation. Obviously, in the West, Judeo-Christianity had a transcendent being. This is all fit together into a certain picture in medieval Europe. That there was a genuinely comprehensible, intelligible cosmos. There was a place for the human being in the cosmos, and there was a divinity that guaranteed that it was benevolent. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can go back there, nor am I I'm not making a normative claim about how good it was. But what I am about to suggest is that modernity, in an amazingly rapid manner, provides fundamental critiques of and dismantlings of cosmos and theos, of a cosmos and of anything higher than secularism.
Yeah.
So what we're left with is just, and you can kind of begin to track this process over the course of, let's say, 500 or 600 years. You begin to see that, first of all, cosmos is replaced by what Pascal saw as this infinite, boundless universe of darkness and light and so on and so forth. So that what is described by theoretical physics today, that's what we understand. And we understand whatever theoretical physicists say about the universe is what we take to be the universe. Okay. That's no longer something that's comprehensible to the ordinary man or woman.
Yeah.
It's no longer something I belong to. Existentialists were responding to this by saying that the universe is meaningless. It's cold, it has nothing to say to us. Well, it's true that the universe is cold and different, but we have no conception of a rethought cosmos in which we might find ourselves. And the second thing is that we've obviously critiqued God to the point at which God is dead, as Nietzsche proclaimed, quite understandably and I think correctly and presciently when he was writing. You could have also seen it from Darwin or from any number of writers in the late 19th century, late 20th century. So what are we left with? I would say we're left with humanism, which is the claim that man is the measure of all things. That's a famous quote. We're left with the view that all we have is a secular form in which human beings relate to one another, correspond with one another, and are fated to be with one another. I can say more about that. There's a meaning crisis, though, if you think that meaning is something that, if I might say, is an act of grace. So I'll define meaning now. I'll say that meaning means being touched by some greater reality. Okay? So that's very loose. That some greater reality is meant to be very loose here, but it's less loose when you have theos and cosmos, because you'd say, well, life is meaningful just in case I am touched or graced by cosmos and by divinity. Meaning is very clear to you when you have no questions. So you know your life is meaningful just in case it's true that you don't feel the fundamental question, what is meaning? Is my life meaningful? Is it meaningful enough? Etc. arising. So that's my particular, somewhat historically inflected way of trying to understand how, at this moment in time, these questions keep arising for us over and over again. It's because the assumption is that all we have left is a postmodern or an existentialist view, according to which meaning it can only now be what I create or make or construct or manufacture. And I think that's to me is a wrong turn. You miss the diagnosis and then you try to solve the problem at the wrong level.
Okay, that's a lot. Let me think. Okay. No, I'm just thinking about the idea of so if we had these three sections, the human, the cosmos, and the divine, the telos, right? Mm-hmm. And the human need for cosmos and telos were fulfilled by, religion, all sorts of different structures, but mainly religion. Could it be that, I'm just thinking of like the way we evolved to desire fatty foods, because there weren't many around, for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, so we love the fatty foods. I'm just wondering whether a similar sort of thing happened with religion. We have a desire for meaning. We have this desire for meaning, and for a long time we were just gorging ourselves on religion, like, oh, this really hits the spot, and then at some point, probably around when Nietzsche said it, that became implausible, and it's slowly word has got out that the religions that we used to be satisfied by are implausible as actual literal descriptions of the universe. But we still have that need. What I find hard to understand is why we would assume that need can be fulfilled. Like, just because we're hungry doesn't mean there's food out there. Do you know what I mean?
Well, the joke,
and I guess the existentialist answer would be something like, well, you have to make it yourself.
But it doesn't It doesn't. If the existentialists are right, we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Oh, that's a good.
It seems to me that a good answer is one that puts things to rest. If you have a child and you are able to, and your child is scared, and you're able to be with that child and comfort that child properly, somehow the child gets put to rest. So for me, philosophy is what helps us to through ongoing inquiry, to put things to rest. It doesn't just keep popping up over and over and over again in different ways. So a philosophical culture would be the one that had come up with an answer that was sufficient to put this matter largely to rest for most people. So all I'm doing is speaking to the fact that when I've been philosophizing for 20,000 hours over the last 10 years.
Not non-stop, right?
Yeah, not non-stop. No, there's been pause. We can go for walks once a day. Something like a lockdown reference. Why does that question keep coming up for different people in different ways? These people are not ones. They're people living in Scandinavia, in Silicon Valley, in New York City, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Australia, and so on and so forth. Why? Why do people in different places at the same time, given our increasingly globalized civilization, why are people asking this question? And not in a theoretical manner whatsoever, but what I would say is an existential manner. That is, it's coming up for them in their life. In fact, I'll be having a conversation later on today. We'll be talking about what is meaning. So this has been an ongoing conversation with this man. So all I'm suggesting is that if we had come to a point of genuine cultural understanding, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we're having the conversation today, I think, suggests that there is something here. What I wouldn't know if I would call it crisis per se, but I'd certainly say it's, in meditational terms, it's a predicament. It's something that keeps arising in different manifold forms for us.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm not sure I agree that it's like an acute crisis. I like the way you said it historically, and you can see it sort of unfolding. That made a lot more sense to me than like panic. It's the crisis. I don't know if anyone's saying that. Maybe that's just complete straw man, but it's just the word crisis. It seems so like dramatic. But I'm interested in that idea of because I think that's one of the differences between my approach to the world and yours. When you're talking about, so I agree we have a predicament, and I agree that lots of people sense that and are looking for answers. But my inclination, or maybe it's not even my natural inclination, maybe it's something I've sort of bullied myself into, is to look for what's true, even if it's not comforting. Like, okay. I would just push, I would just push that comforting thing to the side. So the idea, and
I would say that's philosophy. Philosophy involves looking for what's true, regardless of whether or not it's comforting.
So that idea of putting things to rest, what if, and this is kind of what keeps me up at night, what if the truth is there is nothing that puts this at rest?
Well, that's always possible, to be sure. But now this gets us into the question, the relationship between truth and goodness, or truth and consolation. Okay, here's an example. It's a very vague one. Suppose there's something that you're grappling with. Let's just call it X. So long as you're grappling with X, and X matters to you, and let's say it has a very personal dimension. So it's painful. Are you willing to go along with that so far?
Yeah.
Okay, we've all had this, so far so good. I hope we have.
This sounds familiar.
Okay, well, we know what it's like to keep chewing on it and stewing in it and keep going around in it. We can't seem to make heads or tails of it. It doesn't seem to go away so long as we haven't really seen our way through it. Okay, so what if it's the case that, I don't know, an epiphany or something arises, inspiration, you might want to call it that, given kind of your secular leaning. You feel inspired, or it somehow comes to you that, I see it now. Waha, right? I see now how I can understand X. This is the you might say, this is the truth about X.
Yeah.
Now, consider this moment. How does that feel?
A relief. Yeah.
Okay. All right. QED. I mean, that's the demonstration.
Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah.
So I'm not asking about. So what I find in my philosophical conversations is that if we understand the truth of the matter, there is this amazing epiphenomenon: relief, peace, decontraction. I can breathe again, and you can call it different things, but that's what's really quite almost mysterious about seeing the truth. You're not going for, if you're committed to being a truth seeker or a truth speaker or whatever, however you describe it, you're not necessarily going for what may arise in accordance with X, which is just peacefulness. You're going for understanding X. We're getting to the bottom of X.
Yeah.
But the miracle, to use that language, or what's so serendipitous is that, and just check this in your experience, when you actually see X to the very end and you now feel as if you've gotten to right, you set things to right with it. I get X. I finally get X. It's peaceful. So to me, that's what philosophy does. You aim at the truth. So if I'm going for enlightenment, I'm trying to understand whether or not it's the case that there is something like an ultimate nature, or what my true being is, or can I see the primal face before my parents were born, as Zen might put it in a koan way. I'm looking to get all the way to the end and to see the truth. Now, if it also happens that, as the Buddha says, is nirvana, that is a snuffing out of suffering, that's just gravy, right?
Yeah.
Well, what a wonderful surprise. Seeing the truth of things in the way I'm describing it also is accompanied by peace or decontraction or being able to breathe again.
Yeah,
that's my reply, because usually when people are getting in conversations and they'll have the position you just put forward. Well, I either seek the truth, and the truth can be uncomforting, or people are seeking consolation, but that means they may be involved in pursuits that they would like to believe is true because it's comforting, but isn't actually true.
Yeah.
I'm just asking this from a meditational or contemplative point of view, to look at our experience. When you find something is true and you've been grappling with it, what is that like? It's very nice.
Yeah, although I mean, at least in my experience, and maybe it's just because I haven't hit any of these big truths yet, it's kind of like it's very it's like I have that relief, and I'm like, well, I've sorted that out. That's all nice, fitted into my brain tidily, and then give it a year, give it maybe even just a couple of months, and it starts rattling again, and I'm like, oh no, I've got to re-examine that thing that I just thought I'd figured out like 2 years ago, or 2 weeks ago, or 2 months ago. There's always like some kind of mental upkeep where I'm checking through all those truths, which I think actually, I mean, maybe I'm just saying this because it's the way I am, and it's nicer to believe that the way I am is the right way to be. But I think that's actually quite a good mental habit to have. I think I'd be worried if I was convinced of any one thing for too long. I would start getting concerned about myself, because I feel like that thing of changing is interesting, because we come up in the investigations we do for the show, We talk to people who take all different routes to trying to find meaning and self-realization, all the different things. One that comes to mind is Nema, which is the religion that Aleister Crowley invented. It's very inspired by Buddhism in many ways. Lots of meditation, lots of kind of, aesthetic practices like sitting in uncomfortable positions, lots of drama and ritual and pomp and circumstance. And they're sort of trying to discipline themselves into becoming this sort of perfect expression of their own will. That's the word they use, will. Again, Nietzsche inspired as well. But that idea of there being some sort of end, like enlightenment, perhaps. I don't know whether you see enlightenment as an end, but a conclusion to the constant busy work that human brains have to do. That I find very hard to imagine.
You might find it hard to imagine, but why would you want to hold on to what you're just describing?
Well, because there is beauty in it. It's a kind of mad, chaotic beauty, but there is beauty in that, like the constant turning over and the constant surprising yourself about the thoughts that you've had that you didn't know you could have. And I just think that's kind of like being alive. I don't know. I'm just trying to examine my own discomfort with the idea of reaching some kind of, I think maybe it's just because I'm thinking of it as a conclusion, which to me sounds like an end. And I don't want this to end. I'm having too much fun.
Oh, I don't want, I'm having a lot of fun too. So I'll give you, maybe I can just draw a picture. In Zen, there are 10 ox-herding pictures, and they are meant to, they're one particular description of a path to enlightenment. In the early ones, it's understood in very dualistic terms. The man is looking for the ox, and the ox is enlightenment. He's having various troubles until he glimpses the ox. I want to come to the 10th one already. So you might think that an enlightened person or a self-realized person or someone of the kind you're describing is ethereal or as luminous and has light all around, is wearing nice robes and such, or whatever else, whatever this 1960s or post-1960s description of this Eastern guru is. But consider the Zen one. This is an overweight, kind of nice-looking, overweight, bald, older man who's in the market playing with a child, and he's laughing. He's cheerful. That's an amazingly stunning picture of what it's like to be in the world cheerfully, which is actually a word that Nietzsche uses. Nietzsche talks about cheerfulness in various contexts, or gaiety, or gay signs. What would it actually be like to be in the world not without all the daily confusions, all the endless noise that we experience, all the extra? What would it be like to just be able to play with children and to look at trees and to listen to people, as you're doing now, right? And just listen to them earnestly, without all the monkey mind. And what it would be like to be an older man who's still able to play with a young child at that child's level. I think that's extraordinarily beautiful. And that's not otherworldly, it's not supernatural. There are no cities, as the Indians talk about, these supernatural powers that you might have. I'm not talking about any of those things, whether we can just be agnostic about whether they're correct or not. I'm just talking about someone who's actually able to be vibrating and vibrant with life without the extra noise that seems to be a fundamental part of what gets in the way of our relationships with another, what actually causes us to suffer in various ways ourselves. So to me, that is fun. I think what he's doing there is pretty fun.
Yeah.
This conversation is fun. It's not the case that in this conversation there's suffering going on in the mind right now. There's just my responding or attempting to respond to the questions you're raising and where we're trying to meet each other here without the noise, the confusion, the pain, what will she think if I say this, or if I say that, or I'm socially anxious, or I don't like public speaking. Imagine that the volume on confusions is turned way down, or maybe even is gone. I'm all in.
Yeah. And that is something that feels, like it feels plausible to me, because I can observe in my own life how I've moved more in that direction as I've got older, as we all do. Like, not that I've been working super hard at it, but like it has happened to me. I've become less anxious. And I mean, probably through some of the stuff that we tried out for the podcast. Like I meditate, I do all sorts of things that I wouldn't have contemplated before we started venturing into this world of like spirituality, or whatever we want to call it. And that's like, I guess, what a lot of these the things that we talk about, the sort of woo things we talk about, they are all in the best possible, like the most rosy vision of them. Like sometimes they go into really horrible, weird places, but the rosiest vision of them is aiming for exactly what you just described, whether it's like, stoicism, thelema. Even I can see some of that in the way that people who believe in UFOs talk about sort of shifting of perspective from, in fact, maybe perhaps they're trying to build a cosmos in a way, because they are they're having that, like, when astronauts go up and they look down at the Earth for the first time and they're like, whoa, it's all right there all at once. There it is. And there's even a word for it, but I can't think of what it is at the moment, a phrase for it. That feeling, I've heard people who believe in UFOs talk about the Earth in that same way, because they've imaginatively projected themselves into the eyes of the aliens who are looking down. So obviously this is like, it's something that humans need and want, and we all have sort of different paths, different routes to get there. But also, like from my skeptical side is like, but there's dangerous people trying to sell us like counterfeit versions of this all over the place, and knowing which is which is really hard.
It's not quite as hard as all that. Yes, there's discernment. Buddhists would call it discernment. Aristotelians would call it phronesis, or practical wisdom. But
it must be pretty hard, because there are a lot of people getting duped.
We always need to discern. We need to discern when we go to pick out fruit. What is a nice piece of fruit? What is what's a not so nice piece of fruit? We know the difference because we've seen a lot of fruit and we've seen a lot of vegetables. There are ways of tuning in to see whether or not, first of all, not everyone, that was a big question. So not everyone will have a spiritual teacher or a guru or something like that. People vary where they stand on this matter, but I would say it can be helpful, but not necessary. This is a short answer. So you don't get duped if you don't even need to look for a spiritual teacher per se.
Do you think that we differ in our desire for meaning? Like, do you think there's people who need it more and people who need it less? Or do you think it's like a base human desire? I'm just thinking, like, I recently read a brilliant book called Big Gods, which was all about sort of the evolution of religion. And he talks about how some people are more inclined to be atheists for different sort of personality reasons. For example, he talks about people who are kind of somewhat mind blind. So they find it hard to like imagine another person or agent out there in the world looking down at them. It's just not something that their brains do. And so they find it hard to imagine a god, and so therefore they're atheists. And then there's other different routes he explores to atheism. But so do you think there are some people who actually don't, all this stuff we're talking about that is troubling, or that people come to you to talk about in your practice, is this a quirk of a certain type of person, or is it just we all have it and some of us haven't come across it yet?
I think I haven't read the book that you're referencing, but I think since we're having fun and disagreeing today, I'm getting the sense of what this is like. So I'll go with the kind disagreement. So I would say that if I take my definition of meaning, which could be discussed, but I would say meaning involves coming into contact or being graced by or being touched by or being in contact with some greater reality. And I'm begging off understanding what that is. Could be exactly the Zen view, that somehow it's before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. What's happened is that person's able to be in the world in a fundamentally different way while chopping wood and carrying water. Before, there was probably a lot of swearing. Afterward, maybe there's some singing, for all I know. So if I define meaning that way, I would say I can't imagine it being the case that someone could actually consciously or reflectively live without it. Here's what I mean. We know that in some of the wealthiest countries, such as Scandinavia, suicide rates are fairly high. How can that be if their material needs and their social needs tend to be met quite well? Social democracy as a system is tended to do pretty good and the distribution of goods and opportunities and so forth. Why would people be committing suicide at a rate that's higher than, let's say, the poor Catholic countries around the Mediterranean region? This is a question that Emil Durkheim. I keep quoting Max Weber often, so
he's your go-to.
He's a go-to for a different discussion on a different day, but apparently he's making his way in here. Come on, Max, get out of here. Not this time, brother. Emil Durkheim was asking this question in his book on suicide. Others have surely asked it after. I'm not providing explanation, I'm just pointing to some evidence. That seems to suggest that bare life or surviving or being able to survive is not sufficient for the other question, which is, why am I here? Or what is this all about? Or what makes all this worthwhile? Why would I keep on keeping on? Right? So I think what happens is that I kind of have a little theory based on my experience of speaking to people that goes like this. If what I've said so far is true, then what can happen is that people go along just nicely, they're functioning in the world or coping with the world, as Heidegger would say. But at some point, certain events arise, and I like to say they knock us off our horse. And I call that an existential opening, because at that point, someone begins to turn questions back on himself or herself and begins to ask these introspective questions, really for the first time and in a very charged manner. Before, it was just schooling where you say, oh, is there a God? Or what is reality? Or you might take philosophy courses and think about metaphysics. What is the ontology of objects? If you don't know, if your listeners don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine. It just goes to my point. But at some point, it may arise that you start to feel that things have been opened up and you can continue functioning in the world just fine. But you see yourself, as one of my friends called himself, as a functional nihilist. You just don't think you have any reason for being. You can't discover one yet that slakes your thirst. Now, you might say that's just the human adventure based on what you've said so far. Right? Maybe it's just an incomplete process whereby we're always grappling with these things. But for some people, that opening, that flowering, and I won't call it a crisis. It's not a crisis. It really is an opening up. That opening up allows that person to begin to realize that meaning is not an add-on. I don't think it's not an attaché. It's not a handbag by any means whatsoever. The handbags can be nice. It's something deeply needful, but deeply needful at a different level of our experience. After all, we know that Camus said, I'm paraphrasing, the only genuine philosophical problem is that of suicide. And it's, again, he's French, it's not true, but it's true enough, as pragmatists would say. It is true enough. That is the genuine philosophical problem, because it's really another way of raising the question. Why am I living? If I can kill myself, why on earth do I continue to persist in my existence? But I can't find an answer to that question at the level of how much food I consume, or at the level of my ordinary life, you might say, at the level of my job. Something more I'm beginning to find is needful here to make it all worthwhile, or to make it seem as if it could be all worthwhile, to make it even a more modest claim.
this reminds me, I've just been rereading Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and he talks about the people in the concentration camps who, I think his phrase is, run into the ropes, because it's a way to kill yourself. A popular way to kill yourself, apparently, was to run into the electrified fences. And he talks about how it almost exactly what you're describing. You have to generate something, some reason to live, and obviously they're pretty thin on the ground in a concentration camp. And I was thinking about that, and thinking about this idea of whatever we're calling it, the meaning crisis, and how he and many people like him were forced to generate a meaning. Like, you either generate a meaning or you run into the ropes. Those are your two options. So only people who survived are the people who generated meaning. But for us, for just normal people nowadays, we're not having those, like, we're not being pushed off the horse, like you were talking about, that idea. Like, there's no dramatic moment, like, right, you need to sort it out, you need to figure out why you're living now. It's just like a kind of background static to the world. It's like creeping up, and in a way perhaps that makes it harder, because, like, without, maybe this is exactly why Vivaki uses the phrase crisis, because he wants people to respond dramatically, because he sees it as a dramatic problem. But I think, and it could also perhaps point to some sort of explanation for this, although, I mean, who knows why people commit suicide? It's like a mystery. That's one of the fascinating things about the problem, because we can't talk to them. Although, sorry, I'm just drifting off, but I watched a documentary about people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived, and they interviewed them and asked them why they jumped off. And again, there's a selection bias here, because perhaps people who jumped off and survived but still felt terrible found another way to kill themselves. But the people they spoke to in this documentary all said it was a crazy moment. They didn't say, I felt a lack of meaninglessness, a lack of meaning in my life, and I struggled with it for ages. They were just like, it was like everything, not like my life was great, my life was terrible. And then in that moment, it just sort of came over me, and I did it, and now I survived, and I'm actually really grateful that I did survive. So all that's to say is, I don't know how reasonable it is to conclude that suicide rates up because meaning is down. Like, to put those two things together, because we don't know why people commit suicide. But given that idea, which I think is, again, like a plausible idea, that's at least part of it, that would explain why people in more dire straits have lower suicide rates, because they're not in Frankel's situation, but they're in a situation where they have no choice. They have to make meaning. But it's like,
let's come back to the people on the Golden Gate Bridge. It's always a dramatic moment. We shouldn't expect people to be necessarily reliable narrators of their subjective experience. Now, if they say it's a crazy experience, I don't know how the interviewers asked the question.
Yeah.
Did you throw yourself off the Golden Gate Bridge due to a lack of meaning in your life? Seems like a leading question, probably. But just because someone doesn't use the word meaning or some cognate thereof doesn't mean that it's not necessarily about meaning.
No, that's true.
If the person is saying that my life was miserable, I think it probably entails in many cases, and it was meaningless or some such.
Yeah.
So what do we mean when the person says it was a crazy moment? It might very well be that the straw broke the camel's back. We don't know what's going on there, but if we're going with plausibility here, it's not implausible that the ways that they're describing their experiences could be just labeled meaningless or not very meaningful or some such. But I want to come back to another point you made, which is that if you're in the concentration camp, you're forced into a situation where, as Viktor Frankl put it, you need to come up with or find or create meaning, and I'm using those words appropriately here. So Frankl, you might recall, he uses, I think he has 3 answers to the question. One was love. The second was a stoical attitude.
Yeah.
And the third one was weirdly work. And I've written a lot about work. So I find this one to be, yeah, I find all 3 answers actually quite odd. Love, I was the happiest with.
You're on board with that one.
Yeah, I was on board. But nonetheless, the account is very moving for viewers who don't know this. It's a very moving count. There's a first part which is more experiential, and the second part is more theoretical. And I thought the first part, the more experiential part, was much more moving. But in any case, you're right. Most of us are not. Almost all of us, let's say, in the developed world, in the countries that you and I are in right now, are not experiencing getting knocked off the horse by something like war or a concentration camp or anything as extreme as all that. But I'm not persuaded that it requires something as dramatic or explosive as all that. So I'll be personal. I lost my eldest sister in 2014, very unexpectedly, of late stage cancer. She was diagnosed in 2013. She ultimately lived 12 more weeks, and she died. That was it. Before that, she had never been sick in any significant way. She'd always been healthy. It came out of the blue. We didn't know how long she'd have to live. And you're just getting the information in, so we don't even know how extreme it is. But really, in a very, very rapid manner, that she perished. Now, that didn't happen to me, and I wasn't deeply, deeply close with my eldest sister, but it nonetheless very much impacted me.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and so I didn't need a world war or concentration camp to feel as if I needed to start asking some questions that I hadn't been asking before. And I should add that at that time I've been philosophizing for 5 years, so I've been with other people, and then obviously for 10 years in an academic setting, thereabouts. So I wasn't unaccustomed to asking deep questions by any stretch of the imagination. But I realized that I wasn't asking some of the questions that I'm sure you're asking on this podcast, the ones that might be considered weirder, which is, am I identical with the body? Is whatever I am identical with the body? Is this all there is? Is what secularism describes as what Charles Taylor describes as a immanent frame with a closed spin, a particular way of describing the secular world around us. It would require a lot of unpacking. But is that the end of the story? Is that the story we're telling ourselves? Is that the end of the story? And I didn't know. And so I wasn't in the camp that came up with some kind of affirmative, or you might even say dogmatic answer, some kind of yes answer. I wasn't, but I couldn't be an agnostic, because to me, an agnostic, this doesn't offend anyone, is a little bit like being on the sideline forever. Right? You have popcorn in your hand, and isn't this a nice show to watch as the theists over here speak with the atheists over there? How interesting. Wonderful. So I worry about the agnostic. I think there needs to be some kind of commitment to the inquiry, if it's something that matters to you. Commitment to looking into the matter. So that's what I did. I started to look into the matter. But when I say I started looking into the matter, these matters, what Zen calls the great matter of life and death, I just began to find that through meditation and through other contemplative practices, that the things started to appear very differently from the way they had been when I was younger. And
wow.
I'm not so. And I bring that up not to cause all of your listeners to start crying.
We try not to do that.
Maybe they're skeptics, like, oh, did she really die? Are you sure? Did you just manufacture that story? I can show you that did. But it's just to say that it doesn't require even something as intense as all that for people to start coming out of the unexamined life. I'll use Socratic language here. I think that's the easiest approach. You come out of the unexamined life, and for reasons you almost know not, you come to the examined life.
Yeah.
Such that the things before that had been taken for granted, or it seemed to be self-evident, or it didn't seem to have any kind of crackle to them, now no longer seem self-evident and have some crackle.
Yeah.
The metaphor is trying to describe what it's like to be in the midst of a kind of questioning that really is living in you. You can't not question anymore. You can't not take it up. This is, to me, the heart of philosophy, the heart of what we really think of as philosophy, this living pursuit of what it is to live wisely and fully, is to feel that questions are really crackling for you, and you're letting them come, and you're letting them sink in. And the medieval period talked about gustatory metaphors, that you put them on your tongue, you swish them around in your mouth, you are able, if you can, to swallow them. They become a part of you. So that's my fairly lengthy reply to to your concern that we need to have something extraordinarily dramatic to create existential openings, at least in people's lives. And I haven't found that to be the case. The example I used, to be sure, was rather dramatic, namely the untimely death of my sister. But I think it could have been something far less so, given my given the predilections and proclivities I already had at that point in my life.
This is the way in which I think skeptics and seekers, or whatever we want to call these two groups of people, like, we always come around to this on the podcast, how similar, like, it's good for branding, the seeker and the skeptic, but what you're describing, that questioning, is how I feel like, if skepticism is being done right, that's how it should be. Like, it's about testing ideas, playing with ideas, engaging with things, tasting things. A skeptical advocate friend of mine talks about kicking the tires on a car. Like, it's
right.
physical, it's intense, it's getting in there and really like exploring things, instead of just letting them, like, instead of just taking your mind's first apprehension of whatever the situation is. It's taking that as like, oh, that's an interesting perspective, brain, but what about if we thought about it this way? Like, and being in dialogue with yourself.
Let's set aside the seekers for a moment and just look at the skeptical side, or so-called skeptical side. We know that in the West there was something called ancient skepticism, Iranian skepticism. You may have talked about. Remember, this is not just, I'm doubting whether this argument is true, or whether it has veracity, or whether it's valid or sound. They were doing that, but it had there was more going on. There's more to the story than all that. So the doubting actually was what they allowed for apoke, which is the word for the suspension of judgment with regard to the yay or nay.
Oh, that's a useful word. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, with regard to not affirming and not denying. So that's the apoke. That's the kind of, it's very close to what Stoics might call, equanimity, which is, or I guess, or ataraxia. So the next step actually is ataraxia. They didn't call it steps because this is all a very organic process. They weren't trying to do something. They just noticed that their own experience, that if I suspend judgment, that I come to a place of freedom or tranquility. So skepticism hasn't always been, as it is in modernity, a way of sometimes shooting down arguments, or just saying no. Right. Yeah. This is not the 1980s American war on drugs. It's not just saying no. The skeptics were involved in a way of life that allowed them to look at arguments very closely, very attentively, very honestly, and just to see that they're very close to Buddhists here, right? There's what Thich Nhat Hanh would call a non-attachment to views. Something would happen to them dispositionally speaking, as they were able to get into the non-attachment to views. Now, that sounds rather like a seeker of a certain kind, right? So the seeker apparently is looking for something which he doesn't, or she doesn't have. We could take another podcast to discuss how I think that particular conception of seeking is a mistake. Usually seeking is more like everything happens when you stop seeking. But so it's very close to the skeptics here, in the sense that in both cases there's a willingness. There's a willingness to venture forth. Okay? So they have that in common.
Yeah,
we're willing to venture forth. And there's a willingness to, I hope, earnestly question and see where that takes us. And then there's some kind of transformation or dispositional change that occurs if one is really earnest and open and thoroughgoing here.
Yeah.
And that dispositional change, I've noticed this over the years of philosophizing with people, isn't really pinpointable. You just notice perhaps that the more you do these podcasts, that you're more willing to entertain certain things that you hadn't before.
For sure. Yeah, definitely.
You don't necessarily, you're not saying yay to them necessarily, but something has happened in you dispositionally as you come to as openness, or however you describe this, openness or open-mindedness, this flexibility, this willingness to I like to call it taking up without yet taking in.
Yeah.
Something's happening to us if we're being really honest as we go through this process. We don't have to, I don't really care that much about the labels of seeking and skepticism, but it's the something that happens, what one teacher calls the kind of the perfume. There's a perfume that begins to arise in us.
Yeah, I feel like you're describing the last couple of years of my life. that's what's been going on for me. I mean, not that obviously I'm not particularly hostile to these ideas, otherwise I wouldn't be entertaining the idea of doing a podcast about them. But as I learn more about the experiences beneath the ideas, things change in the way I see them. And so my podcast partner, Kat, is into astrology. That is something I would probably still roll my eyes at and do sometimes. But I can see it now in a different light. It's hard to describe. My perspective on that whole thing has changed because I can see it through her eyes, and I realize that what she gets out of it and what she's trying to do with it and what it's fulfilling in her isn't what all my skeptic friends think it is. Like it's something about being able to shift into, just for a moment, to shift into the other person's perspective and be like, oh, things look a lot different from over here.
Yeah, so there's a possibility of empathy or compassion or things of that sort, and these are somewhat of a crude linguistic label to put on that shift you're pointing to. But just think of your friends for a moment. I hope this is not critical of them. I just mean you're involved in something that's transforming you, while your friends are just saying, "Oh, astrology, that's stupid. That's woo. That's stupid." Where does that come from, though? I mean, I certainly have been there. I finished a PhD in academia. I don't think astrology is really currying favor there. It's probably not going to get you tenure in most departments. So it's definitely, and academia tends to be more analytical, to be sure, often in some quarters more scientific. It has a kind of a dubious cast of mind. It really does cultivate you in a certain skeptical mindset. But there is a reply to this kind of skepticism, and the reply is, hang on a second, look within yourself, because what are you invested in here in terms of an identity? Where are you taking your stand? And why does it feel so good to say astrology's silly? Yeah. Why does that feel so good for you? Why do you feel so self-righteous, a little bit smug? And I know this experience because I was quite an arrogant young man. I know what it's like to taste that certitude, that righteousness. It feels good. I mean, it's perverse, but it feels good. So there's still an investigation there. We need to be able to move. I mean, part of it is to be loving or to be compassionate, to be able to, as I said, take up things without necessarily taking in. You bring them into your house, but okay, here's a kind of a crude joke, but you can I like to say this about meditation. Someone's coming in the first time, I like to say, if a thought arises, there's no problem with inviting it to tea. You allow it to rise, you invite it to tea, but don't make the mistake of inviting it upstairs and making love to it. That's what So the skeptic needs to allow it to rise and have tea with it. But it doesn't follow that one has to immediately take it upstairs and make love to it.
Yeah. I think the thing that really jumped out at me there is the identity piece. And this is something that I like. This is, everyone has this. Like, we have the labels that we apply to ourselves and the way we think of ourselves. And I like, for a long time, you know, I've got my hippie side, and I've always been like, oh, I don't like labels, man. But I didn't really. I was thinking more of like the kind of the practical way, and like, I don't want to be seen as a X. I don't want to, like, I didn't quite appreciate until I started working through the stuff that we talk about in the podcast, that the labels weren't just something that I presented to the outside world. They were ways that I defined myself, and in a way, like, put boundaries around what I was allowed to think. And that's been a really interesting shift for me, and it has made me realize how important, not necessarily like just throwing away labels altogether because they're useful, but questioning them and not taking them quite as seriously as maybe as I did before.
Yeah, that is the openness. If you stake yourself to an identity, such as I am the skeptic, I believe in scientific rationality, the scientific method, neuroscience, materialism. I'm not sure what your friends are like, but this is probably about right.
Yeah.
But then there's still one unasked question. That is, why does it create such an emotional charge in you when you're around someone who claims to be interested in numerology or astrology or whatever else? That's the beginning of the inquiry, and I'm not going to go through the whole inquiry, but that, if you actually let that question in, it is a transformative starting point. Imagine we fast forward, someone has actually gone through that inquiry. Then one is in the presence, let's say, of someone who's talking about numerology. I know nothing about numerology. I just remember being at an event. I gave a talk once, and someone was talking these terms, and I didn't know what he was talking about, but I was interested. I was right. I was interested. Hopefully, this doesn't sound egotistical. I just mean I was there. I was present. I didn't have to say, "Oh, this is silly," and what is this guy doing talking to me? He's got the wrong guy. Those are, again, Buddhist terms for suffering. I can be there, and it's fluid. I don't have to think that numerology is what I'm going to start tomorrow. I don't have to think that tarot cards have kind of the clue to understanding the mythology of the universe. I don't have to think any of those things, but I can, as Whitman says, I am great, I contain multitudes. I can allow there to be multitudes contained herein.
Yeah.
And that's nice because I'm not caught. That means that there's I think there's one person, David Chapman, calls it meaningness, and he talks about, he uses fluid metaphors. It's not he's coming from a Buddhist background, but you have to attach yourself to being Buddhist. Even you don't attach yourself to, but it's just such that I can actually, or one can actually, be welcoming and kind to others. There's so much room for that right now. If we want to talk about getting past the current culture war, as some of my friends are interested in talking about, this is a nice place to begin. Right?
Yeah.
How wonderful would it be if people, they can still be materialists if they want to be materialists. They can still think that matter is wrong. Yeah. But there can be the openness to people who are idealists. I mean, I'm speaking in the philosophical sense, or we can be open to the idea that there is consciousness that is not an epiphenomenon of matter. Why? That is the beautiful starting point for, let's say, a new culture. A new culture be one in which people hold their labels less tightly and are able to enter into dialogue in ways that don't require commitments to views, but certainly allow, oh, that's interesting. Oh, wow, I had never thought of it that way. Or how curious. Right? And it's the dispositional transformation I'm obviously hanging my hat on during the course of these, the last set of remarks I've been making. It's not that you're saying yes or no. It's that you're thinking, it's that you do enough of these things, and somehow, very inexplicable ways, there's a levity. There's a levity about being in the presence of people who are very different from you.
It's so funny. I usually try and wrap up these interviews with the seekers by asking if you have any advice for skeptics, but I feel like you've just given us lots to think about. So thank you ever so much. It was a really interesting conversation, and I think I'm going to be rolling the ideas around in my head for some time. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It was just very lovely to be here today and to get a chance to jam with you.
Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can check out Andrew at andrewjtaggart.com. And if you want to keep up with The Seeker and The Skeptic, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or our podcast, or why not both? And you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Seeker Skeptic. And we'd love a few more reviews on our Apple podcast page. So if you want to leave a rating or review, we'd greatly appreciate that. You can also support the show on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/seekerskeptic and help us keep the lights on. Thanks for listening.